Hello there, ControlMyCanon users. This is Russ Bucher from ControlMyCanon, and in this video we're going to take a look at the new OpenGL GPU Live View mode. So basically in version 5.4 we introduced a new Live View mode that uses your graphics processor unit on your computer to process this video stream that we get during Live View from your camera. And the advantage of that is that it's a slightly better frame rate. There's less usage of your CPU on your computer, and you kind of offload all this graphics processing to your GPU. Now, most new computers or newish computers have a GPU either as a separate video card or integrated with the CPU, and so most computers will be able to use this. And I'm just going to demonstrate a little bit of what Live View looks like using this, and then we're going to get into how to actually set it all up and look at the different switches and toggles and settings that you can use to adjust how you use this Live View mode. Okay, so first of all, I just have a very simple scene set up here in a makeshift light box, and let's take a look at this home-built, very inexpensive light box. So this is a Canon 60D with a 105mm macro lens running on battery, and there's a piece of iron pyrite made in this really cheap cardboard and plastic and photocopy paper light box. Budget there about $1, I think, but it works really well. Now that we've seen how we have the light box and the subject set up here, I can just show you that we have ControlMyCanon set up here in Live View mode. And you see there's some flashing red graphic here. This is using the Live View outer exposure mode, and we'll show you how to set that up in a moment. It's basically saying these areas here that are flashing in red are very close to being overexposed or underexposed. We could control those parameters to determine what we consider to be over or underexposed. So okay, so now I've got grid lines on here. I have a focus box, and we can see that we have the near part of this iron pyrite specimen in focus. Now, if I want to capture an image of this, all I need to do is click on the shoot button, and there's two of them here. There's one here in the Live View window, and another one over here way on the left side with tabs. The reason we have two is you can actually detach this window, put it on another monitor. So we're going to take a shot. And then we can go to the image browser to see the resulting shot. And here I have the thumbnail viewer, the thumb strip viewer set to also show the exposure and the histogram for that particular image. And we could see here that it hasn't been over or underexposed. If it were, you'd see little red dots in the upper left or upper right hand corner. Look at the metadata for this. Yeah, it looks pretty good. So we're going to explore now how we can tweak this Live View. So for now, I'm just going to turn off Live View. Close this tab. We'll kind of start from scratch how you would see it when you initially start up ControlMyCanon. Now I have a Canon 60D hooked up here, and it has a 105mm macro lens. Very generic settings here. I have a very low ISO because I don't want very much noise. I'm just going to shoot in JPEG here, and I have a separate folder for all my pictures I'm going to capture. I'm going to use it just a standard image counter. We're going to save it directly to the computer. And I've already created a profile here called Iron Pyrite because I want all these settings I make, including the settings I make for Live View, to be saved here on this particular profile, because the settings I use here may not be the settings I want to use, say, when I am doing a macro of a rose or shooting a portrait of someone. So the advantage of the profile is you can easily go back to a profile and reuse it later. Okay, so let's go back into Live View. And then you could toggle back and forth. By default, it's the spacebar on the keyboard. So Live View, Image Browser, Live View, Image Browser. Or you can just click these two buttons up here to go back and forth. All right. So what do we have here? Let me just first of all take a look at these buttons that we have up here. Now you see this is all a separate window here. What we can do, if you have another monitor, if you like, you can go live view detached. There we have our live view window, and there's the image browser window in behind. You can actually detach the image browser window as well and just kind of leave this tab set on the left here. So depending on your workflow, you know, you can reposition these windows anywhere you like, but for now, I'm just going to reattach it back here. Okay, so now everything's all in one window. So to enable GPU mode, you need to go up to the Tools menu and Preferences, and by default, the GPU mode is not enabled. That's because we think that most people can run GPU mode, but not all. So those who can't run GPU mode do not have these prerequisites. And what happens is, you know, if you turn on GPU mode, you go checkmark, use GPU, hit close, you'll need to restart ControlMyCanon. You don't have to restart your computer or anything, just ControlMyCanon. Next time you start it up, you'll be able to use it in GPU mode. But it requires OpenGL 3.1, which most video cards, you know, with updated drivers, you know, in the past 3, 4, 5 years, you know, back to say 2013, should have this. And if it doesn't, if you don't have the prerequisites, all you're going to see is when you go into live view mode, you'll see a perfectly white screen. You'll see nothing but just a white background. And if that's the case, then you need to upgrade your drivers to ensure they're OpenGL 3.1 compatible and have enough video memory. And you'll probably need, a good 128 megabytes of video memory minimum. It really varies per computer. So you'll know it works if it shows the live view image and it's not white. If you're using ControlMyCanon in virtualized mode, say running under VMware or VirtualBox, most of those don't properly support OpenGL at all, or you know, support the graphics processor, and so those will likely also be a white background, and you'll have to just turn this off and use the non-GPU live view mode for virtualized environments. Okay, but so I have it set for use GPU, and I'm also going to go here under browser. We have a new feature in 5.4 that allows you to just check this here. So every time we capture an image, it's going to display it. And then after 5 seconds or so, it's going to flip back into live view. It's the same as pressing that spacebar to toggle it on the keyboard. Back to live view. So now we have a bunch of layers here. You can see these lines here for the grids and the focus box, and you know, this image analysis here that's telling it's over or underexposed. Those are layers. We can actually turn those off. So you press this button here, they're all off. And you can hook all these buttons up here to keyboard shortcuts right here. So we need to go here under live view layers. Now this is where we control all these overlays. So initially here you can see I have some open. We have the exposure, outer, open. I'm just going to turn this off. And close all of these. We're going to go through these one by one and see what each one does. So first of all, here we have the background. Now the background is just for the background of this image, because you could do some wild and crazy things here. You can do something like go to image, turn the opacity of the image down, show the background as whatever you want, say like a checkerboard or a different color altogether. And then you can put your overlays on it. Okay. And if I just continue to reduce my opacity, you have nothing but overlays. So that just allows you to separate the image and the image analysis overlays that we have. Sometimes you have a very complex image and it's tough to see, tell the difference between the colors of an overlay and the background. But okay, so let's go back here. I'm going to turn my opacity back up to normal, and see these buttons here? Those buttons mean default. So if you left click them, it brings you back to the defaults. But if I wanted to have, say, for example, a checkerboard, I could just go here. You could change the color of the checkerboard, size of the checkerboard. But by default, the checkerboard's off. Then you can have different color background. You can see it's also the background you see off the edge. Sometimes it's nice to have a bit of a border that is, a dissimilar color to what's in your image. So if I bring my opacity back up, you can see how it shows along the edge and in the background. But since opacity is at 1, it's not transparent at all. Okay, so I'm going to set this back to default and close that. So now when we get into the image settings here, there's some interesting things we can do. Well, you saw how we can control the opacity. Okay. Now we can also control the gamma. Sometimes you're shooting and it's not very bright in live view, especially if you're using strobes. And there's a couple of ways around this. Okay. So let's say, as you saw in the early video clip I had earlier, we have continuous lighting here shining on this piece of iron pyrite, so it's plenty bright. I mean, even at ISO 100 and f8. So not a problem here. But if I was to do something like, say, turn some lights off, and I'm just going to simulate here what it's like to have, say, strobes. Okay, so that's reasonable for strobes. Maybe it's a little bit dark, but this is a problem because now we're looking at the same scene, except we can't see what the heck we're doing. So what you can do is control either the gamma or the brightness, but these two settings increase the brightness in two very different ways. Okay, so the first one, the easiest one, is this the gamma. But when it's very dark like that, it doesn't work really well. And all it is increasing the gamma of this very dark image. And you can kind of make it out a little bit, but this is not terribly useful. It'd have to be a little bit brighter originally before this is better. So I'm not going to use gamma. And gamma is okay if you're making very small adjustments to brightness. Now these brightness adjustments here don't make any difference to the eventual exposure of your captured image. It's just how we see it in live view. Okay. So brightness. Now this is the interesting one. This is the old ISO pinning setting that we used to have on earlier versions. And in fact, if you use the non-GPU live view mode, it's still called ISO pinning. ISO pinning basically means that we see that you have it set to 100 ISO. We know you want to shoot at 100 ISO. Okay. However, this is too dark. So we are going to just bring up the brightness. Like this. Now, in the background, what's actually happened is ControlMyCanon has changed the ISO. It's ISO 6400. You can see what you're doing now. Okay, so this is good. You'd be able to see your model if you're using strobes. But when you shoot, you want it to use 100 and not 6400, so that's no problem. In fact, if I shoot right now, you'll notice we're at 6400. Go shoot. And the image was actually captured at 100. Of course, this is the point at which your strobes would have fired, and you would have captured a beautifully composed and exposed image. Okay, so that's what brightness does. Let's go back to live view here. And you see, if you move it around here, it's really just changing the ISO for purposes of displaying in live view. So if you go back here, it will reset it back to the ISO you had set previously. Now it's back to 100. I'm going to turn the lamps back on. Back here we are. So now we no longer need this brightness control, because with continuous lighting, I would adjust the strength of my lighting before I adjusted really anything else. Okay, so let's take a look at what else we can do here. We have rotation, so we can rotate this counterclockwise, inverted, clockwise, back to auto. Now this is useful if you need to just override it from whatever your camera orientation is sending it to you. Sometimes when you have it a copy stand and it's pointed straight down, it's going to maybe have the wrong orientation because the sensor gets confused. So you can use this to override that. And we also have an option here to reduce jitter. Now, what reduced jitter does is it reduces the noise in a live view stream. It doesn't reduce noise in your final captured image. But sometimes, you can get an image here that is perhaps a very high ISO, and you just need to reduce the amount of noise. So the best way to demonstrate that is I'm going to go back here and turn off some lights. Hopefully we could see this. I'm going to zoom in on it. If you look closely, you can see some sparkling happening here. And this is really just the noise and artifacts that are generated during a JPEG compression, because these live view images are received as a JPEG stream of pretty well fine JPEG format. So I turn on reduce jitter. You'll notice that this noise is reduced. So when you're working at high ISOs, you can wind up with a lot of this noise problem. So I go, say, up to 400 and let's say 400 and maybe 16. So now you can see it a little bit more. This is getting pretty dark, but what I can do here now is increase the ISO a little bit more. And on some cameras, you actually have to close live view first before you can adjust the ISO. You can see it's kind of noisy. Turn on reduce jitter. It reduces it. And sometimes at very high ISOs, it can be, all the noise and the jitter can be a little bit annoying, a little bit distracting. So by using the reduce jitter option, you just make it a little bit nicer to look at. Now we can also look at this as a positive. I'm just going to go back and set this where it should be. We're at 108. There we go. Okay, so now when we view it as a positive, it basically reverses the image. So this is useful if you are scanning negatives, taking pictures of negatives. If this was a real negative, it would show you what it would look like in real color when you converted it back to real color in post-processing. So it gives you an estimate of the colors and what the intensity levels are when you are scanning it. And you can show it as grayscale. And this is useful if you want to really separate the overlays, such as this, with the background. Now, none of these settings change how your final image is going to be captured. It only shows the change here on what you're seeing in live view. Okay, now save on capture allows you to capture an image of the live view stream, which is a pretty small image, when you capture a real image. So let's give this a try. I have save on capture. I'm going to capture. You can see it captured this one. Okay, it's going to flip back. I'm going to go into the browser. I'm going to say, let's take a look at this folder that it's saving in. We're going to go Explorer. And you can see here that it has saved image number 21. That's 21 JPEG. It also saved this thing, 21.lvbmp. That's live view BMP. And what it is just a bitmap of the live view image that was being displayed when we captured the real image. So I'm just going to rename it to a bitmap. And there it is. Now if we look at the size of it, it is much smaller than the regular image. 1056 by 704. Okay, so that's the stream that we're receiving, about 24 frames per second, maybe as low as 15 on some Canon bodies. Now you can use this later on to modify this and use it as an overlay. So I'm just going to turn that off. Save on capture. Okay, that's the images. Guides. So if I go back into live view here, and I'm just going to turn off this exposure. We have an option to turn on and off the grid. And in the grid here, we can set the amount of divisions in the grid and the thickness of the lines and the contrast. So this allows you the contrast to always see what's behind the grid line. So it's basically, it doesn't allow the grid line to blend into the image. So you can always see them. That can be very subtle with this low contrast or not so subtle with a high contrast. Control the grid division. So if you want rule of thirds, you bring it down to this. Right here. Okay, now we also have, let's leave this up so you can see it. We have rebatments. I had no clue what this was initially when I saw it online. A rebatment is a compositional line. So, you know, we kind of have rule of thirds. You know, you try and get things here on the rule of third lines, you know, something of interest maybe at the rule of thirds intersections. Well, a rebatment is used in a similar way. You'd put something here along this line of interest. There's rebatment line 1 and rebatment line 2. And the position here is calculated as a ratio of the width and height of the image. And you could see this here. So if I just went with rebatment line 1 and I changed the crop to say this one here, you can see the position of the rebatment relative to the width has changed because the height has changed. If it would be square, will it be centered? Yeah, there's nothing when it's squared. How about this crop? So it really varies on the eventual cropping that you're going to use. So it's just really a compositional overlay. Now you can also say something like, we know that in post-processing we want something that is cropped, say 1.85 to 1, and that you want the image on say this particular rebatment line. You could do that just by setting these options here. Or 16 to 9. Right there. So by putting on these crops and compositional lines here, it just helps you line up your image to get it ready for post-processing. Otherwise, you kind of have to imagine where you're going to crop it to make sure, and where your compositional lines are. Okay, so I'll take the rebatment off, put the grid back on, lower the contrast. The focus box. Okay, so we use this for auto-focusing. If you just left-click somewhere, it moves the focus box, and we can control the thickness of this and the opacity. Now, if I double-click, it will attempt to autofocus. This orange means that it's in the process of focusing. If it comes back as bright green like this, that means that the body figured that it achieved the focus. If it could not achieve focus, it will go orange and then come back red. Now it's going to hunt for focus for up to 5 seconds. You could also set a hotkey for focusing as well. Or you could use this button here, which says the same thing. When it says attempt to contrast focus, that's really what it is an attempt, because contrast focusing is a very often not successful thing. You need a lot of contrast, and this image has a lot of contrast, so it's working well. But you try to autofocus on this area here of just this white background, it's not going to work too well because there's no contrast there. So it searches, it hunts, it gets confused, and it just gives up and says, I can't focus. So you need to provide enough contrast and lighting to give it a chance of having some success. Okay, I'm just going to reduce the size of this, the opacity a little bit so it's not too obtrusive. Focus peaking. All right, so now when we're doing focus peaking, this basically allows us to see areas of the image that are clearly in focus. And this is helpful if you want to maybe do focus stacking or really double check the focus, because let's say I wanted to be focused right on this little tip of this rock here, right there. How do I know I'm in focus? Well, you could increase the magnification and look at it this way. And with the magnification here, you have 3 levels maximum. Not all bodies will have all 3. In this case, with a 60D, if I click on 3, nothing happens because we really only have 2 levels with a 60D. However, if I go here, bring it back to 2, okay, so we could say that, yeah, that looks like it's in focus. But if you have a complex scene, it's tough to tell if you're not zoomed in. So what you can do here is you turn on the focus peaking. And the focus peaking overlays this graphic here, which I have set as green, but you could change the color here. Let's change it to this funky purple. Now let's make it blue. Okay. So it's saying that it's detected a sharpness or very high contrast, which would indicate focus in these areas here along this plane of this subject. We could control the sensitivity of this. Here it's thinking a lot more things are in focus, or you can just tighten it up a little bit. And you can see it right there. Now it becomes a little bit more difficult to see, so this is when you might go back here and turn it to grayscale. Turn the opacity down. Now there's 2 methods of detecting here. So what we can do here is the first one is a Sobel transparent, and the level controls the transparency of this. Normally you have to keep it up pretty high. The one I prefer though is the Sobel opaque albedo, and it basically embosses, or like in Photoshop how you can do embossing of an image. That's kind of what it does here. It simulates a direction of light, which is done with the level. And then it attempts to reconstruct it kind of in 3 dimensions. So it gives it a bit of shading. And you control the sensitivity. Now for me, on a complex scene like this, I find it's a little bit easier to see what is in focus when I look at this. And it's very easy just to turn this on and off. And you can control the sensitivity. So I'll normally leave it right about like this. If your particular composition or your subject, if you can't really see nice edges like this, you could just change the lighting direction, the level. Okay, so that's focus peaking, and it just allows you to, kind of see the areas that are in focus. Now I'm going to change the focus because we're coming up to focus step. And, when you do your focus, you can do autofocus, but watch what happens here. Okay. out of focusing. You can also step the focus. Now this works on most lenses that have a CPU focus motor. And what you can do here is you can click on this and it changes the focus remotely. This is really what we do when we're doing a focus stacking workflow, is we're going to change the focus, capture an image, change the focus, capture another image. So we could change it by a fine amount, which is 50, and these ones with a single greater than or less than sign are the fine controllers. The coarse controller is one with the 2 greater than and less than signs. So it just changes it a lot more. Now the amount that you use really varies on the amount of on the lens that you're using and the subject you're trying to cover. So what our users will often do is, they'll do a combination of things for focusing. They'll double click on it. You see it hunting for that focus. Then they'll use these buttons to try and fine tune it a little bit. And you can really fine tune it. You can make this number quite small. And you can set the a shortcut key. So instead of having to click on this, you can just use the shortcut keys to go in and out of the focus. It's very finely. And you could still zoom in on this too. So it's really up to you how you want to use it. I'm just going to turn this off so you can see the difference here. Here I'm zoomed in. I'll turn off that layer, which is easier to tell that you're in focus. For me, it's this, but whatever works. Okay, I'm going to zoom back out. Turn off focus peaking and the focus step. Now, before we continue with the exposure, I just want to take a look more at the items here on the toolbar. On the Canon, we also have the ability to do a depth of field preview. So you click on this and it'll change the f-stop here to allow you to see exactly what you're going to shoot at. And the settings that you have, it kind of varies on how well this is going to work and on which body. But let's say you're going to shoot at f8. What often will happen is your body will just open this right up to the smallest value f-stop. And it'll open it right up to get as much light as possible. And that's what you see in live view. But if you really want to see what it's going to look like when you shoot, you click on this and it'll change it a little bit. And then you'll see exactly what the depth of field is when you shoot. Okay, so let's see what else we have. We have the exposure inner. Now, you notice there's no histogram here. And the reason for that is, when you look at a histogram of a live view image, especially something that's high key like this, which is white background, it really doesn't tell you much to see that something is blown out. For example, you may purposely blow out the background on a high key image. Histogram is just going to say, hey, something's blown out, but you don't know what is blown out. So that's where the inner and outer exposure markers come into play. So let's turn on the inner. And the inner basically tells us that show us everything that is between this value and this value of exposure. And you might do that, for example, if you're shooting faces for video, you want to have the facial exposure of a certain range. So what we could say here, show me everything between 10% and let's say 90%. So this gives you an indication of what areas are in a desired area of exposure. You can change the opacity of this, color. So that's inner exposure. The one I tend to use more is outer exposure. I want to see areas that are outside my acceptable exposure range. Now here I'm saying less than 5% and greater than 95%. So something that is very dark or very bright, I want to see it. So I'll turn on cycling here just to flash it a little bit. We can change the color. I'll keep it as red. Change the opacity. And I'll bring this back up. All right, so I could see here that these areas here are at risk of being too light or too dark. So I'm going to change this a little bit here and say go down to 1%. Bring this up to 1% to 99%. So not very much. In fact, it's this area here. If I zoom in on it, it's saying that this area is blown out or very close to being blown out. So we want to be careful with this and ensure that we don't make this too bright. So what you could do here is back off on your lighting a little bit, change some of your other exposure settings to make sure it's not blown out. And it'll also show you areas that are too dark. So I'm going to turn off a light here. You can see these areas are flashing. That's because they're too dark. Turn my light back on. So you can use these inner and outer exposure markers to ensure that your exposure is correct before you shoot. Now, most bodies have what's called an exposure preview mode, and that's what we're working in right now. That means that the live view image you see is the same as what you would shoot at. Okay, so which is a good thing because we could really analyze our exposure like this. However, if you're not in exposure preview mode, the body is going to adjust the ISO behind the scenes to always make sure it's nice and bright for you, but it doesn't allow you to really see what your eventual exposure is going to be. Okay, turn these off. Or you can also do these in different channels, so I could see it in, say, the red, green, or blue. But normally I just keep it on luminance. Now, if you really wanted to see what your final exposure is going to be, you just capture an image. I'm just going to go back here, and we'll look at this now in the image browser. Now we could see here as I move my mouse around, it shows you this vertical line here in the histogram. Very high here, pretty low down here, but not too low. And I also have the thumb strip configured to show a histogram. So at a glance, I could see if it's over or underexposed. Now, if we look back at these other images we've shot during this video, look at this one back here when we're experimenting with ISO pinning or the brightness control. It was very dark because we had the ISO set at 100. And this little histogram here has a red dot here, which indicates there's a problem here on the low end. So things were too dark. And you can see here that is, you can see the luminance red, green, and blue values here over this area right there is, should be 0 on some of them. Luminance 0. So that basically means that it's blown out. And there's areas here that everything is 0 right there. So between the inner and outer exposure markers and these histograms in the image browser gives you a good indication of what your exposure will be and what it eventually was when you captured the image. Okay, back into live view. Turn this off. And let's take a look at the overlay. So an overlay allows you to overlay another image on top of it. You could put in a PNG or a JPEG or I think a bitmap as well. And here I have one already set. If you click here, it selects the image. If you look in the folder where ControlMyCanon Canon was installed, there's actually an overlays folder here, and we just threw in a couple sample ones. Here's one that is like a frame. And we turn it on. And all we've done here is taken, you know, that LVBMP that we captured earlier when we did save on capture setting in the images part. We basically took that, so we know what the dimensions are, and went into like GIMP or Photoshop, made a frame, saved it as a PNG, and now we're using it as a guide. And so now we might try to compose, for example, in this box. It's really up to you what you want to put here. We can show it as grayscale. Pretty simple, it's already gray. And we can control the opacity of it. So you can go back here and turn off your guides and use your own custom overlay. Now we have another option here, which is use your current live view image. This is going to get a little bit weird here, but what I'm going to do here is I'm going to click on this. Okay, and now I have an overlay. And the overlay is what I'm seeing on live view. Now this only makes sense if I actually go and move the camera a little bit. So watch what happens when I just pan a little bit. Now you can see that it's overlaying the live view image that we had a little while earlier on top of the current live view image. In fact, if I turn this off, this is currently what the composition is because I moved the camera. We overlay what that earlier live view image is. So what you can use this for is if you're doing stop motion. And we actually have a separate stop motion workflow that does a lot of this work for you. And really what it does is it overlays the previous live view image over top of what you're currently seeing in live view. So you can play it back and see exactly what the motion is when you're attempting to make your stop motion composition. Okay, I'll turn that off. Now the last thing we have here is the message. And so if I change this here, this basically is a message you see up here. So you could change the size, the color, background color, and the opacity of the background. So you just set that for whatever you like. Just going to put it back to default there. Okay. Now there's one more thing I'd like to show you, and that is the live view monitor. If we click on this here, we get a separate window. You could take this window and move it out to, say, another monitor, or maybe you are doing something like you're having a client trying to preview what you're looking at, and in your particular case, you know, you might have the guides on, you might have focus peaking, you might have some outer exposure, but you don't want your client to see that. You see, this one doesn't have any of that on it. It's basically the same thing you see in your regular live view with the layers turned off. So you could grab this, move it off to another monitor. And to turn it off, we just click here, and it's done. All right, so that's how you use the new GPU mode live view in ControlMyCanon. Happy tethering.